you ever been sitting in the passenger seat while a loved one with ADHD was driving and found yourself completely perplexed by how quickly their emotions changed? Perhaps another driver merged into their lane. Maybe someone didn't leave enough room for them to merge. Perhaps the driver in front of you stopped safely for a yellow light instead of accelerating through the intersection, or someone was driving the speed limit in the fast lane. From your perspective, you might have been thinking, that driver didn't really do anything wrong. Yet the emotional reaction inside your own car seemed far greater than the situation appeared to warrant. If you've ever experienced that, you're not alone. What makes these moments so fascinating is that the emotional reaction is often shaped by everything that happened before the interaction with the other drivers on the road. Perhaps you left the house 20 minutes later than planned because time blindness caused the drive to begin under pressure. Perhaps traffic was heavier than expected. Perhaps several red lights, construction zones, or unexpected detours had already increased cognitive load. By the time another driver hesitates at a green light, merges into your lane, or stops for a yellow light, the nervous system may already be operating under a tremendous amount of physiological stress. In those moments, the driver in the other car often becomes the most visible part of a much larger neurological process. The frustration may appear to be directed toward them, but they are frequently the final event in a sequence of accumulating stressors. The person in front of you may have done nothing objectively inappropriate. They simply happen to be the last stimulus encountered by a nervous system that had been managing increasing cognitive load, time pressure, executive functioning demands, and emotional activation for several miles. Looking back over my own 34-year marriage, I can recognize this pattern much more clearly today than I could years ago. If we had left later than planned, every red light felt more significant. Every slow driver seemed more frustrating. Every missed opportunity to merge appeared more personal. It wasn't that the other drivers had suddenly become worse drivers. It was that our brains were experiencing the same traffic very differently because one nervous system was already carrying far more stress before those interactions ever occurred. That understanding changes the question completely. Instead of asking, why are they so angry at that driver? We begin asking, what had their brain and nervous system been managing long before that driver entered the picture? That question leads us much closer to the neuroscience of ADHD than the traffic ever could. Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. I'm Stephanie Buckley, an AMFT, ADHD, and OCD Specialist, family systems coach, and integrative mental health practitioner. If you're joining me for the first time, welcome. This podcast is where psychology, neuroscience, Bowen family systems theory, solution-focused therapy, and real-life family experiences come together to help us better understand ourselves and the people we love. My hope is that every episode leaves you with not only a deeper understanding of the brain, but also practical, evidence-based strategies that help families experience greater peace, stronger relationships, and healthier communication. As always, this podcast is educational in nature and is never intended to replace individualized medical or mental health treatment. Today we're talking about a subject that almost every adult has experienced, but very few people truly understand. Whether you're the person behind the wheel or sitting in the passenger seat, you've probably witnessed someone become unexpectedly angry while driving. Maybe another driver cut them off. Maybe traffic suddenly stopped. Maybe someone forgot to signal before changing lanes. Perhaps they missed an exit, took a wrong turn, or found themselves running late. Within seconds, a relatively small inconvenience seemed to transform into intense frustration. Voices became louder. Hands tightened around the steering wheel. Heart rates increased. The emotional climate inside the vehicle shifted almost instantly. For families living with ADHD, these moments often occur more frequently and sometimes with greater intensity. Parents tell me they worry about teaching their teenager to drive because they already see how quickly frustration escalates. Spouses describe feeling anxious every time they ride together because they never know when a routine drive might become emotionally charged. Adults with ADHD often tell me they don't understand why they become so upset over situations they know, logically, are relatively minor. One of the most common statements I hear in my therapy office is, "I don't even recognize myself when I get that angry." That statement deserves our attention because it tells us something profoundly important. Most people are not choosing anger in those moments. Instead, they are experiencing a nervous system that has become overwhelmed. Understanding that distinction does not remove accountability for our behavior. Every one of us remains responsible for how we speak, how we drive, and how we treat the people around us. However, understanding the neuroscience behind emotional regulation gives us something far more valuable than blame. It gives us a roadmap. When we understand why the brain responds the way it does under stress, we become far more capable of building strategies that prevent escalation before it begins. One of the greatest misconceptions about anger is that it is the first emotion someone experiences. In psychology, we often describe anger as a secondary emotion. A secondary emotion is an emotional response that develops because another, often more vulnerable, emotion occurred first. Think of an iceberg floating in the ocean. The small portion visible above the water represents the anger everyone notices. Hidden beneath the surface, however, are emotions that are often much more painful to experience. Fear, shame, embarrassment, helplessness, anxiety, disappointment, feeling inadequate, feeling misunderstood, feeling as though we have failed yet again. Understanding this sequence fundamentally transforms the way we conceptualize emotional behavior. Rather than focusing exclusively on the anger we can observe, we begin asking a far more clinically meaningful question. What had the brain and nervous system been experiencing before anger ever became visible? That shift in perspective is profound because it redirects our attention away from the behavioral outcome and toward the neurobiological processes responsible for producing it. What appears to be a sudden emotional reaction is often the culmination of a complex neurological sequence that has been developing beneath the surface for several minutes. By the time frustration reaches conscious awareness, multiple cognitive, emotional, and physiological systems have already been working together to interpret the environment, allocate cognitive resources, regulate competing demands, and determine whether the situation requires an adaptive response. The behavior we eventually witness is frequently the final expression of a neurological process that has been unfolding long before anyone else recognized it. To appreciate why this happens, we have to become familiar with one of the brain's most sophisticated survival structures, the amygdala. Although often described as an almond-shaped cluster of neurons located deep within the limbic system, that simple anatomical description fails to capture its extraordinary importance. The limbic system serves as one of the brain's primary networks for processing emotion, assigning meaning to experience, consolidating memory, generating motivation, and coordinating the physiological responses necessary for survival. Within this network, the amygdala functions as an extraordinarily efficient surveillance system, continuously evaluating both the external environment and the body's internal physiological state for information that may signal danger, uncertainty, or significant change. Its role is not to think analytically or solve complex problems. Its responsibility is far more immediate. Determine whether the current environment appears sufficiently safe for higher-order reasoning to remain in control, or whether the body should begin preparing to protect itself. Remarkably, This entire process unfolds outside of conscious awareness. Long before the thinking brain has an opportunity to evaluate what is happening, the amygdala has already begun performing an extraordinarily rapid assessment. At its core, it is asking a single question: am I safe? That question is not asked once at the beginning of the day. It is asked continuously. Every conversation, every unfamiliar sound, every unexpected change in the environment, every facial expression, every shift in another person's tone of voice, and every subtle physiological sensation is rapidly evaluated through the lens of safety. While driving, the amygdala may reassess the environment dozens, if not hundreds of times within only a few minutes. It evaluates the driver who suddenly merges into your lane, the horn sounding behind you, the brake lights appearing unexpectedly in front of you, the realization that you have just driven past your intended exit, and even the subtle sigh from the passenger sitting beside you. Each of these experiences is processed long before conscious reasoning has an opportunity to determine whether the situation truly represents a meaningful threat. From an evolutionary perspective, this remarkable efficiency is precisely what enabled our species to survive. For thousands of years, hesitation carried significant risk. An individual who paused to carefully analyze every movement in the surrounding environment before deciding whether to respond was less likely to survive than someone whose nervous system reacted immediately. The amygdala therefore evolved to prioritize speed over precision. From a survival standpoint, responding unnecessarily to a harmless stimulus was a relatively small cost compared to failing to recognize a genuine threat. Evolution favored nervous systems that occasionally produced false alarms because false alarms were far less dangerous than missed dangers. Although the world surrounding us has changed dramatically, the architecture of the brain has changed very little. Most of us no longer encounter predators while traveling to work, taking our children to school, or driving across town. Instead, the nervous system spends much of its time responding to experiences that threaten something equally meaningful. From the brain's perspective, our sense of competence, predictability, social belonging, emotional connection, and psychological safety. Running late for an important appointment, realizing we have made a mistake that someone else has noticed, receiving unexpected criticism, disappointing someone we love, experiencing conflict with a partner, managing financial uncertainty, or hearing the GPS announce that it is recalculating after we missed our exit can all activate many of the same neural pathways originally designed to protect us from physical danger. This is one of the remarkable paradoxes of modern neuroscience. Objectively, a missed freeway exit poses very little threat to our physical survival. Subjectively, however, the brain may interpret that same event as carrying significant emotional, relational, or psychological consequences. The amygdala is responding less to the freeway exit itself than to what that moment represents. It may symbolize failure, embarrassment, disappointment, criticism, or loss of control. Once the brain assigns that emotional significance, the physiological stress response begins almost immediately. Heart rate accelerates. Breathing becomes more rapid and shallow. Muscles tighten across the neck, shoulders, and jaw. Attention narrows toward the perceived source of the problem. Cognitive resources are redistributed away from reflective thinking and toward immediate action. By the time frustration becomes visible, the nervous system has already reorganized itself around the goal it has prioritized for thousands of years: survival. To understand why anger can escalate so quickly while driving, we have to introduce another remarkable structure within the brain called the prefrontal cortex. Located directly behind the forehead, the prefrontal cortex is often referred to as the brain's executive control center. If the amygdala functions as the brain's smoke detector, constantly scanning for danger, then the prefrontal cortex functions much like the chief executive officer of a company. It evaluates information, weighs options, inhibits impulsive reactions, anticipates future consequences, solves problems, regulates emotions, and helps us make thoughtful decisions
rather than emotionally driven ones. Nearly every executive functioning skill we have discussed throughout this series, including planning, organization, working memory, sustained attention, response inhibition, cognitive flexibility, self-monitoring, and emotional regulation, is coordinated by networks involving the prefrontal cortex. Under ordinary circumstances, the communication between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is remarkably efficient. Imagine a calm parent comforting a frightened child during a thunderstorm. The child hears thunder and immediately becomes frightened. The parent gently says, "I know that sounded loud, but we're safe inside the house." That interaction mirrors what happens neurologically when the prefrontal cortex is functioning well. The amygdala sends an alarm, but the prefrontal cortex evaluates the evidence and responds. "Thank you for letting me know. I've looked at the situation, and we don't need to react as though our survival is at risk." The emotional brain and the thinking brain work together as partners, allowing us to remain calm while still responding appropriately to genuine danger.
The difficulty is that this partnership begins to change when stress accumulates. Imagine you've already had a demanding day at work. You skipped lunch because meetings ran long. You haven't had enough water. You slept poorly the night before because your child was sick. You're trying to make it to your son's baseball game before the first pitch, and you're worried you'll disappoint him if you're late. As you're driving, another car abruptly changes lanes without signaling, forcing you to brake suddenly. At the same moment, your phone begins vibrating with work notifications. The GPS announces a road closure ahead, and your passenger reminds you that you promised to stop at the grocery store on the way home. None of these stressors independently may seem overwhelming. Together, however, they create what psychologists refer to as cumulative stress, meaning the nervous system is responding not to one isolated event, but to the combined weight of multiple demands occurring simultaneously. This is where the concept of cognitive load becomes extraordinarily important. Cognitive load refers to the total amount of mental effort required to process information at any given moment. Every decision, every distraction, every emotion, every responsibility, and every unexpected event adds another demand to the brain's processing capacity. Imagine carrying a backpack throughout the day. Every responsibility you encounter is another textbook placed inside. Responding to emails adds one book. Managing your child's schedule adds another. Remembering to pick up medication adds another. Navigating unfamiliar roads adds another. Regulating your emotions after an argument adds yet another. Eventually, the backpack becomes so heavy that even something relatively small, like missing an exit or someone driving aggressively, feels impossible to carry. The nervous system is no longer responding only to the present moment. It is responding to the accumulated weight of everything that came before it. For individuals with ADHD, this experience can be amplified because the executive functioning system is already working harder to coordinate attention, working memory, organization, and emotional regulation. Research suggests that ADHD involves differences in the efficiency of communication among multiple brain networks rather than simply a deficit in attention. This means that everyday tasks often require greater mental effort. While someone without ADHD may have cognitive resources available to recover quickly after an unexpected driving event, the individual with ADHD may already be approaching the limits of their executive functioning capacity before the unexpected event even occurs. Missing the exit isn't simply another inconvenience. It may become the moment that exceeds the nervous system's ability to adapt. Another brain structure that deserves our attention is the anterior cingulate cortex, more commonly referred to as the ACC. Although it receives far less attention than structures such as the amygdala or the prefrontal cortex, the ACC serves as one of the brain's most sophisticated integration centers. Anatomically, it is located along the medial surface of the frontal lobes, forming part of the cingulate cortex that sits between the emotional networks of the limbic system and the executive functioning networks of the prefrontal cortex. Because of its unique location and extensive neural connections, the ACC functions as a communication hub, constantly integrating emotional information, cognitive demands, attention, motivation, and behavioral responses. Rather than working in isolation, it helps coordinate these multiple systems so the brain can adapt efficiently to an ever-changing environment. One of the ACC's most important responsibilities is supporting cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility refers to the brain's capacity to modify thinking, adjust behavior, abandon ineffective strategies, consider alternative perspectives, and adapt when circumstances change unexpectedly. It allows us to shift from one plan to another without becoming psychologically stuck. It also contributes to error detection, conflict monitoring, problem solving, decision making, and our ability to recover when life unfolds differently than we anticipated. In many ways, the ACC helps the brain answer an important question. Given this new information, how do I adapt? Driving provides an excellent illustration of this process. Imagine you're on your way to an important appointment. You've planned your route, estimated your arrival time, and mentally rehearsed how the drive will unfold. Then, without warning, electronic signs announce that an accident has closed the freeway ahead. Within seconds, your original plan is no longer possible. A brain with strong cognitive flexibility rapidly updates its internal model of the situation. It recognizes that the circumstances have changed, accepts that reality no longer matches the original expectation, activates problem-solving networks, selects an alternate route, and redirects attention toward the new plan. Although the situation may still be disappointing, the brain remains psychologically flexible enough to adapt. For many individuals with ADHD, this transition requires substantially more neurological effort. The original plan remains highly salient, while shifting toward a new one can feel disproportionately difficult. The brain may continue comparing reality to the original expectation, increasing frustration with every passing moment. Instead of immediately reallocating cognitive resources toward solving the problem, the nervous system may become increasingly preoccupied with the fact that the problem exists at all. This is not a reflection of intelligence or motivation. It reflects the increased executive functioning demands associated with rapidly updating mental representations while simultaneously regulating emotional responses. The ACC is also heavily involved in conflict monitoring. It detects when something is not unfolding as expected and signals that adjustments are necessary. During driving, this may occur when another driver unexpectedly merges into your lane, traffic comes to a sudden stop, GPS instructions change, or you realize you've just driven past your intended exit. The ACC is constantly comparing what you expected to happen with what is actually happening. The greater the discrepancy, the greater the demand placed upon cognitive flexibility. When executive functioning is already under strain, those repeated discrepancies can accumulate, increasing both cognitive load and emotional activation. The encouraging news is that cognitive flexibility is not a fixed ability. Like many executive functioning skills, it can be strengthened through the process of neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to reorganize and form new neural pathways throughout life. Every time we intentionally practice adapting to change rather than resisting it, we are reinforcing neural circuits that make flexibility more accessible in the future. Each time we pause before reacting, consider an alternative explanation, accept that circumstances have changed, or generate multiple solutions to the same problem, we are exercising the very networks that support cognitive flexibility. Research suggests there are many practical ways to strengthen these neural pathways. We can intentionally expose ourselves to manageable changes in routine, encouraging the brain to tolerate novelty without immediately becoming overwhelmed. We can practice generating multiple solutions whenever a problem arises, rather than becoming attached to the first idea that comes to mind. Mindfulness and controlled breathing help reduce amygdala activation, allowing the prefrontal cortex and ACC to remain more fully engaged during moments of stress. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches individuals to examine rigid thinking patterns and replace them with more flexible alternatives. Adequate sleep, regular aerobic exercise, and consistent management of ADHD symptoms also improve executive functioning by enhancing communication among the prefrontal cortex, ACC, and other executive networks. Every detour accepted without escalating frustration, every unexpected change approached with curiosity instead of resistance, and every opportunity to say, "That wasn't my original plan, but I can develop a new one," represents another opportunity for the brain to strengthen the neural pathways that support adaptation. That is one of the most hopeful messages in neuroscience. The brain is not merely reacting to today's experiences, it is continuously being shaped by them. One of the simplest ways to strengthen cognitive flexibility is to intentionally practice Plan B thinking. Instead of developing only one solution before leaving the house, teach your brain to automatically generate several possibilities. Before beginning a drive, ask yourself, if traffic is heavier than expected, what will I do? If my usual freeway is closed, what is another option? If I miss my exit, what will my response be? The purpose is not to become anxious by anticipating every possible problem. The purpose is to teach the brain that there is almost always more than one acceptable solution. The more frequently we practice generating alternatives, the less threatening unexpected change begins to feel. Another highly effective strategy is to build intentional pause points into everyday life. When something doesn't go according to plan, resist the urge to respond immediately. Instead, ask yourself, what are 3 possible explanations for what just happened? Perhaps the driver who didn't let you merge never saw you. Perhaps they're rushing to the emergency room. Perhaps they're simply distracted. This simple exercise strengthens perspective taking and interrupts the brain's tendency to become attached to a single interpretation of events. Cognitive flexibility grows every time we teach the brain to tolerate multiple explanations, instead of assuming the first explanation is the only accurate one. Families can also strengthen cognitive flexibility by changing the language they use at home. Instead of saying, "That's not how it's supposed to happen," try asking, "Given what's happening now, what's our next best option?" That subtle shift encourages the brain to move from resistance to problem solving. Children who repeatedly hear adults model this type of thinking gradually begin developing the same internal dialogue themselves. Over time, flexibility becomes less about personality and more about habit. Driving provides daily opportunities to practice these skills. When GPS announces that it is recalculating, intentionally notice your first emotional reaction before responding. Rather than thinking, "This has ruined everything," practice saying, "The plan has changed and my brain is capable of making a new plan." When traffic unexpectedly slows, remind yourself, "I can't control the traffic, but I can control how I respond to it." Every one of these moments becomes a repetition that strengthens the neural circuits responsible for flexibility instead of rigidity. One of my favorite strategies with clients is what I call mental rehearsal. Elite athletes have used visualization for decades because the brain activates many of the same neural networks when we mentally rehearse a skill as when we physically perform it. Before driving, spend 30 seconds imagining yourself missing an exit. Picture yourself taking a slow breath, calmly following the GPS as it recalculates, and arriving safely. Then imagine another driver cutting you off. Visualize your shoulders staying relaxed, your grip on the steering wheel softening, and yourself choosing not to chase or retaliate. By mentally rehearsing flexible responses before they are needed, the brain becomes more prepared to access those responses under real-world conditions. Finally, remember that the environment can either increase cognitive flexibility or compete with it. Leaving the house 10 or 15 minutes earlier, entering the destination into the GPS before putting the car in drive, selecting your clothes the night before, gathering your keys, wallet, and phone in one location, filling your gas tank before it becomes urgent, and reducing unnecessary multitasking all decrease cognitive load. When the brain is carrying fewer competing demands, it has significantly more capacity to adapt when life inevitably throws something unexpected your way. Perhaps that is one of the most encouraging lessons neuroscience offers us. Flexibility is not something you either have or you don't. It is something you practice. Every unexpected detour, every missed exit, every change in plans, and every opportunity to pause before reacting gives the brain another chance to strengthen the neural pathways that support resilience, adaptability, and thoughtful decision-making. Over time, those small moments accumulate into meaningful neurological change, and that is the extraordinary promise of neuroplasticity. This brings us to a concept I believe every family affected by ADHD should understand: frustration tolerance. Frustration tolerance refers to our ability to continue functioning effectively despite obstacles, delays, disappointments, mistakes, or unmet expectations. Every day, life presents us with opportunities to practice frustration tolerance. Waiting in traffic, standing in long lines, losing internet service during an important meeting, discovering that a store is out of something we needed, hearing no, having our plans unexpectedly change. These moments require the brain to tolerate discomfort without becoming emotionally overwhelmed. For many individuals with ADHD, frustration tolerance is more challenging because executive functioning, emotional regulation, and cognitive flexibility are already working harder than average. Again, this is not about weakness, it is about neurological workload. I often explain this to families using a smartphone analogy. Imagine your phone battery begins the day fully charged at 100%. Every app running in the background consumes energy. Streaming music uses a little. GPS uses more. Bluetooth, text messages, and navigation continue drawing power. By late afternoon, your battery may be running low even though you've done nothing wrong. The ADHD brain often functions in a similar way. Executive functioning consumes considerable neurological energy throughout the day. By the time an unexpected driving stressor occurs, the battery may already be significantly depleted. When families understand this, they stop interpreting emotional reactions as evidence of laziness or poor character. Instead, they begin asking a much more compassionate and clinically accurate question. How full was their cognitive backpack before this even happened? That question shifts us away from judgment and toward curiosity. It also prepares us for one of the most powerful conversations we'll have today, understanding why anger behind the wheel is rarely about the driver in front of us and is so often connected to the emotional systems operating within our families. That's where Bowen family systems theory offers one of its greatest contributions, and that's where we're headed next. Bowen family systems theory: why anger rarely belongs to just one person. One of the reasons I have spent so much of my professional life studying Bowen family systems theory, developed by psychiatrist Dr. Murray Bowen, is because it fundamentally changed the way I understand conflict. Before I was introduced to Bowen's work, I tended to think about emotional reactions the same way many people do. Someone became angry, so I assumed the anger belonged entirely to that individual. Someone yelled, so I focused on helping that person communicate differently. Someone withdrew emotionally, so I naturally wondered why they were pulling away. Bowen challenged that way of thinking by proposing something both simple and profound. Human beings do not function as isolated emotional units. We function as emotional systems. An emotional system means that the feelings, behaviors, anxieties, and reactions of one family member inevitably influence every other member of the family. Just as dropping a pebble into a still pond creates ripples that extend far beyond the point of impact, anxiety introduced into a family system spreads through relationships, often without anyone consciously recognizing that it is happening. The remarkable part is that this process is largely automatic. No one wakes up in the morning deciding they are going to absorb another person's anxiety. Our nervous systems simply do what they were biologically designed to do. We continuously read facial expressions, tone of voice, posture, breathing patterns, and subtle changes in emotional energy. Long before words are spoken, our brains are evaluating whether the people around us appear calm, frightened, irritated, disappointed, or emotionally unavailable. Think again about sitting in the passenger seat while someone with ADHD is driving. They miss the exit. Perhaps they immediately become quiet. Maybe they grip the steering wheel more tightly. Their breathing changes. They mutter something under their breath. Even if they haven't said a single word, your nervous system has already begun interpreting those signals. You may notice your own heart rate increasing. Perhaps your shoulders tighten. You begin calculating how much additional time the detour will require. You glance at the GPS. Maybe you instinctively reach toward your phone to search for another route. Before either of you consciously realizes what is happening, both nervous systems are now participating in the same emotional event. This is what Bowen referred to as the family emotional system. Rather than asking, who started the argument, Bowen encouraged us to ask, how is anxiety moving through this relationship? That question changes everything because it moves us away from assigning blame and toward observing interactional patterns. In my own marriage, I can clearly see how this dynamic developed over the years. When my husband became frustrated behind the wheel, my anxiety naturally increased because I wanted us to arrive safely and on time. The more anxious I became, the more I tried to help. I monitored the GPS. I reminded him which exit was coming next. I checked traffic reports. I watched the road signs. Every one of those behaviors was motivated by love. Yet every one of those behaviors also communicated something to his nervous system. I don't think you have this under control. Those were never the words I spoke, but our nervous systems often communicate far more powerfully than our language. Bowen described one of the most common responses to rising anxiety as overfunctioning. Overfunctioning occurs when one member of a family begins assuming increasing levels of responsibility in an effort to stabilize the emotional system. The overfunctioner becomes the organizer, the planner, the reminder, the scheduler, the problem solver, and often the emotional manager for everyone else. On the surface, overfunctioning appears incredibly responsible. In fact, overfunctioners are often praised for how dependable they are. The challenge is that every emotional system seeks balance. As one person assumes more responsibility, another person often assumes less. Bowen referred to this complementary pattern as underfunctioning. This does not mean the underfunctioning individual is lazy or incapable. It means the emotional system has quietly redistributed responsibility in response to anxiety. When I look back over our years together, I realize there were times when I unintentionally became my husband's external executive functioning system. I entered every address into the GPS. I reminded him when to leave. I anticipated what he might forget before he forgot it. While my intentions were loving, I also recognized that anxiety had quietly become the leader of my behavior. I wasn't acting primarily from confidence or collaboration. I was acting from fear that something might go wrong. Bowen would say that anxiety had begun organizing the relationship. Parents often do exactly the same thing with children who have ADHD. A mother checks her son's backpack every morning because she doesn't want him to forget his homework. A father repeatedly reminds his daughter about soccer practice because he worries she'll lose track of time. Parents log into the school portal, schedule appointments, pack lunches, manage medications, and solve problems before their children even have an opportunity to practice those skills independently. Please hear me carefully when I say this. These behaviors almost always come from profound love. They are understandable. They are compassionate. Yet they also raise an important clinical question. Are we helping because the child genuinely needs temporary support, or are we functioning from our own anxiety? This is where Bowen's concept of differentiation of self becomes extraordinarily important. Differentiation refers to the ability to remain emotionally connected to the people we love while also maintaining our own thoughtful, principle-driven functioning. A differentiated parent does not become emotionally detached, nor do they become emotionally fused with another person's distress. Instead, they remain calm enough to think clearly even while someone else is upset. Differentiation allows us to respond rather than react. It allows us to tolerate another person's discomfort without immediately rushing in to eliminate it. Imagine how differently that car ride unfolds when one person remains differentiated. The driver misses the exit. Instead of immediately rescuing or taking over, the passenger notices their own anxiety first. They take a slow breath. They relax their shoulders. Then they calmly say, "It's okay. We'll reroute. We'll get there." That simple sentence does far more than provide directions. It communicates safety. It tells the nervous system that this mistake does not threaten the relationship, the person's competence, or their worth. The amygdala begins receiving evidence that the situation is manageable, allowing the prefrontal cortex to gradually re-engage. This process is known as co-regulation, one of the most important concepts in developmental psychology and interpersonal neurobiology. Co-regulation refers to one regulated nervous system helping another nervous system return to balance. Infants borrow the calm nervous systems of caregivers long before they can regulate themselves. Children learn emotional regulation through thousands of moments in which an adult remains calm during their distress. What many people don't realize is that adults continue borrowing one another's nervous systems throughout life. Married couples co-regulate each other. Coaches co-regulate athletes. Therapists co-regulate clients. Teachers co-regulate classrooms. Families either amplify one another's anxiety or help one another return to emotional stability. The beautiful truth is that co-regulation is contagious in the same way anxiety is contagious. A calm nervous system spreads, thoughtfulness spreads, emotional safety spreads. And when we begin changing the emotional climate inside the car, we often begin changing the emotional climate inside the entire family. As we begin bringing today's conversation together, I want to leave you with something I hope changes the way you think about ADHD and driving forever. If you've been listening to this series, you've probably noticed that I have spent very little time talking about trying harder. That is intentional. Families affected by ADHD have often spent years hearing messages that sound something like this: pay closer attention, slow down, think before you act, just calm down. While those suggestions may be well-intentioned, they rarely produce lasting change because they ask the brain to perform executive functioning skills without changing the conditions under which those skills are expected to occur. One of the most encouraging discoveries in neuroscience is the concept of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's lifelong ability to reorganize itself by forming, strengthening, and refining neural connections in response to repeated experience. For decades, scientists believed the adult brain was largely fixed. We now know the opposite is true. Although the pace of change differs throughout the lifespan, the brain remains capable of learning, adapting, and strengthening new pathways well into adulthood. Every time we consistently practice a healthier habit, create a reliable routine, or repeat a new behavior. We are encouraging the brain to make that pathway more efficient. The phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together, first associated with neuropsychologist Donald Hebb's work on learning, captures this beautifully. Repeated experiences strengthen neural networks, making those behaviors increasingly automatic over time. That understanding is incredibly hopeful because it reminds us that ADHD is not a life sentence of chaos or failure. Instead, it invites us to stop asking, why can't they remember? And begin asking, what systems will help their brain remember more consistently? This shift is one of the foundations of solution-focused therapy, an evidence-based therapeutic approach developed by Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Rather than becoming consumed by analyzing problems, solution-focused therapy helps individuals and families identify strengths, recognize exceptions to the problem, and build upon what is already working. It is grounded in the belief that people possess far more resources and resilience than they often recognize. Tell me about a time your son stayed calm while driving. What was different? When does your daughter seem most focused behind the wheel? What conditions seem to help your spouse drive more confidently? Those questions are not minimizing the challenges. They are helping us identify existing strengths so we can intentionally recreate them. Perhaps the teenager drives significantly better when they have slept well the night before. Perhaps they are more attentive when music is turned down and conversations are minimal. Perhaps they consistently remember directions when the destination is entered into the GPS before leaving the driveway. Those moments matter because they provide clues about how the brain functions at its best. This naturally brings us back to one of my favorite concepts in psychology, scaffolding. In educational psychology, scaffolding refers to temporary or ongoing supports that enable a person to successfully perform a task that would otherwise exceed their current level of independent functioning. The concept was strongly influenced by Lev Vygotsky's theory of the zone of proximal development, which proposes that learning occurs most effectively in the space between what someone can already do independently and what they can accomplish with appropriate guidance and support. As competence grows, the support can gradually be modified, reduced, or replaced by new strategies. Families often misunderstand scaffolding because they confuse it with rescuing. Rescuing says, I'll do it because I don't think you can. Scaffolding says, I'll build a support that helps you succeed while your brain develops greater independence. Those are profoundly different messages. Entering the destination into the GPS before putting the car in drive is scaffolding. Keeping a phone out of reach while driving is scaffolding. Leaving 15 minutes earlier than you think you need to is scaffolding. Using a shared digital calendar with reminders is scaffolding. Creating a written checklist before leaving the house is scaffolding. Taking medication as prescribed, when appropriate and under the guidance of a healthcare professional, is scaffolding. Practicing difficult driving situations with a trusted adult before attempting them independently is scaffolding. In our own marriage, one of the simplest yet most meaningful changes we made was deciding that every destination goes into the GPS before we ever leave the driveway. It no longer matters whether we've driven there once or 100 times. We no longer rely on memory simply because memory worked yesterday or last week. We rely on systems because systems are far more reliable than working memory under conditions of stress. Entering the destination into the GPS has become one of the simplest forms of executive functioning scaffolding in our home. It reduces cognitive load before the drive even begins, allowing the brain to devote more of its resources to the extraordinarily complex task of driving safely rather than trying to remember exits, street names, or alternate routes. That one habit alone has prevented countless missed exits, unnecessary arguments, and avoidable stress. Over the years, we realized that the GPS was only one piece of a much larger system. We also began looking up our destination before leaving home, so we understood how long the drive would realistically take, whether construction or traffic might require additional travel time, and when we actually needed to leave the house. I learned that if we needed to walk out the door at 5:30, saying, "We need to leave at 5:30," rarely produced the outcome we wanted. Instead, I would communicate an earlier departure time, often 15 or 20 minutes before our true deadline, not as a way of manipulating the situation, but as a practical accommodation for time blindness and the unexpected variables that inevitably arise during transitions. Those additional minutes created breathing room for the nervous system instead of beginning every drive already under pressure. Preparation also extended well beyond the car. We discovered that reducing the number of decisions required at the last minute dramatically improved the entire morning. If we were attending a wedding, a holiday gathering, a business event, or a dinner with friends, we talked about the dress code the evening before. Clothes were selected, shoes were located, and everything needed for the next day was laid out before leaving for work that morning. Eliminating those last-minute decisions reduced decision fatigue, minimized cognitive overload, and allowed the transition from work to home to feel significantly less rushed. As we continued learning about ADHD, we found ourselves building additional external supports throughout everyday life. Calendar invitations were accepted immediately rather than trusting they would be remembered later. Appointment confirmations were entered into digital calendars with multiple reminders instead of relying on memory alone. Items needed for the next day, keys, wallet, phone charger, sunglasses, and anything required for an appointment, were placed together in one designated location the night before, eliminating the frantic search that so often accompanies leaving the house. Even simple habits, like checking the weather before going to bed or filling the gas tank before it became urgent, reduced the number of unexpected decisions the brain was forced to make while already managing competing demands. Perhaps one of the most important lessons I have learned is that successful families are rarely the families with the fewest challenges. They are the families who become exceptionally skilled at designing environments that support the way each person's brain functions. They understand that consistency reduces cognitive load, routines strengthen executive functioning, and thoughtfully designed systems allow people to devote their mental energy to what matters most instead of constantly recovering from preventable crises. That is the essence of scaffolding. It is not about lowering expectations. It is about building an environment where success becomes more predictable than struggle. I often encourage parents to think less about changing their child's brain and more about changing the environment surrounding the brain. Environmental design is one of the most powerful yet underutilized interventions for ADHD. We can reduce unnecessary distractions before driving. We can establish predictable departure routines. We can place essential items in consistent locations. We can agree that emotionally difficult conversations will wait until after the drive instead of beginning them while navigating busy traffic. We can teach teenagers that pulling into a safe parking lot when emotions become overwhelming is not failure. It's emotional maturity. These are not accommodations that lower expectations. They are strategies that allow expectations to become achievable. As parents, spouses, and caregivers, one of the greatest gifts we can offer is curiosity instead of criticism. The next time someone you love becomes angry while driving, consider asking yourself a different question. Instead of wondering, why are they overreacting? Ask, what was happening inside their brain and nervous system before I ever saw the anger? That single question invites compassion without removing accountability. It allows us to hold two truths simultaneously. Behavior matters, and understanding the brain helps us change behavior more effectively. I want to close today's episode by returning to where we began. Road rage is rarely just about traffic. Anger is rarely just about the missed exit. More often, those moments are revealing a nervous system carrying stress, cognitive overload, emotional vulnerability, and executive functioning demands that have quietly accumulated throughout the day. When we understand the neuroscience, we stop reducing people to their worst reactions. When we understand Bowen family systems theory, we recognize that our own nervous system influences everyone riding in the car with us. When we understand solution-focused therapy, we stop asking only what is wrong and begin building upon what is already working. One of the most hopeful discoveries in modern neuroscience is the concept of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's remarkable ability to reorganize itself throughout life by forming new neural pathways in response to repeated experiences, intentional practice, and supportive environments. For many years, scientists believed that the brain became relatively fixed after childhood. Today, we understand something very different. The brain remains capable of learning, adapting, and strengthening new patterns across the lifespan. Every time we practice a healthier response, develop a new routine, or consistently rely on evidence-based external supports, we are quite literally helping the brain build more efficient neural networks. That realization carries tremendous hope for individuals living with ADHD and for the families who love them. Executive functioning can be strengthened. Emotional regulation can improve. Habits can become more automatic. Relationships can become healthier. Families can interrupt patterns that may have existed for decades and replace them with new patterns built upon understanding, intentionality, and consistency. Meaningful change rarely occurs because someone was criticized into behaving differently. Lasting change develops when the brain is given repeated opportunities to experience success within an environment that has been thoughtfully designed to support the way it functions. As I reflect on my own 34-year marriage, I don't think about the missed exits nearly as much as I think about what those moments taught us. They taught us that the goal was never to rely on willpower alone. The goal was to create systems that reduced unnecessary cognitive load before the drive even began. Those systems have changed the way we travel, but more importantly, they have changed the way we understand one another. We have learned that preparation is not about perfection. It is about creating the conditions that allow both people to function at their very best. So tomorrow, before you start your car, I want to invite you to do something that may seem remarkably simple, but is grounded in both neuroscience and psychology. Pause for just a moment. Take one slow, intentional breath. Notice the state of your own nervous system. Ask yourself whether you're already carrying stress, feeling rushed, or mentally juggling more than your brain can comfortably manage. Enter your destination into the GPS, even if you've driven there dozens of times. Give your executive functioning system one less responsibility to carry. Allow technology to support your brain so your brain can devote its energy to the complex task of driving safely. Sometimes we think safe driving begins when we shift the car into Dr. VE. I would suggest it begins much earlier than that. It begins the moment we intentionally reduce cognitive load. It begins the moment we regulate our nervous system. It begins the moment we choose thoughtful preparation over unnecessary mental effort. Because the safest driver is not necessarily the one with the fastest reflexes or the greatest confidence. The safest driver is often the one whose brain has the greatest opportunity to remain calm, regulated, and fully present behind the wheel. Until next time.